Something was found in a cave, something so old, so fragile, and so full of secrets that the world was never quite ready for what it contained. For decades, the greatest minds on the planet studied it. They argued over it. They dedicated entire careers trying to understand it. And still, the deepest questions remained unanswered. Then one day, a machine looked at what human eyes had missed for 2,000 years. And what it found changed everything. It begins, as many world-altering stories do, with a boy and a goat. In the winter of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd was wandering the limestone cliffs above the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, searching for a stray animal somewhere in the rocky wilderness of Qumran. What he stumbled upon instead was not a lost goat. It was a lost world. Inside a narrow cave carved into the cliff face, he discovered clay jars, old jars, ancient jars, and inside them, wrapped in linen that had somehow survived the desert's brutal silence. For nearly 2 millennia were scrolls. News of this discovery moved slowly at first, the way earthquakes begin below the surface before the ground finally shakes. Scholars were skeptical. Traders were opportunistic. Governments were curious. But when the texts were finally examined by serious researchers, the weight of what had been found became impossible to deny. These were not ordinary manuscripts. These were among the oldest surviving copies of sacred scripture ever discovered. Books of the Bible, religious hymns, community rules, prophetic visions, all of it preserved by nothing more than clay, linen, and the dry mercy of the Judean desert. Over the following years, 11 caves in and around Qumran gave up their secrets. Nearly 900 individual scrolls or scroll fragments were recovered. Some were almost perfectly preserved. Others were shattered into thousands of tiny pieces, like a puzzle that history had broken apart on purpose. In total, the texts represented the work of an entire ancient world, a community of people who had lived, believed, and written with urgency, as if they knew their words needed to survive long after they were gone. The Dead Sea Scrolls became the most studied, most debated, and most guarded collection of ancient texts on Earth. They rewrote our understanding of early Judaism. They informed everything we thought we knew about the origins of Christianity. They pushed the history of the Hebrew Bible back by roughly 1,000 years compared to previously known manuscripts. Scholars called it the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Some called it the greatest of any century. But the deeper they looked, the more questions emerged. Who exactly wrote these texts? The scholarly consensus, built over decades, pointed to a Jewish sect known as the Essenes, a group of devout, reclusive men who had retreated to the desert to live in spiritual purity and await what they believed was an approaching divine judgment. This explanation was tidy. It made sense. It satisfied most people. But not everyone was convinced, because the more carefully the scrolls were examined, the more the evidence began to resist simple answers. Some texts did not fit the theology of a single isolated group. Some fragments seemed to originate from entirely different traditions. Some passages contradicted each other in ways that suggested they had not been written by the same people, or even in the same era. There was another problem, a problem that seemed almost embarrassingly basic, yet had stubbornly refused to yield to decades of expert analysis. Many of the scrolls appeared to have been written by multiple authors, multiple hands. But how many? Who were they? Where did they come from? Were the scribes copying texts that already existed, or were they composing something entirely new? These questions sat at the center of the Dead Sea Scroll mystery, like a locked door that no one had quite found the key to. Open. Human analysis had limits. Reading ancient handwriting requires years of specialized training, comparing letter forms across hundreds of fragments, accounting for the natural variations in a single person's handwriting over time, and distinguishing between the styles of different scribes across centuries of text is work that strains even the most experienced paleographer. Add to this the fact that many fragments are damaged, faded, or partially destroyed, and the problem grows from difficult to nearly impossible. Scholars were doing their best, but their best was not enough to answer the deepest questions buried inside the parchment. Then something new arrived, something that did not get tired, something that did not need rest, something that processed data at a scale no human brain could match. Artificial intelligence had already been reshaping science, medicine, and engineering when researchers began turning its attention toward ancient history. But the version of machine learning applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls was not the basic text recognition software used to digitize old books. This was a far more sophisticated system, trained to analyze the microscopic geometry of individual letter strokes, the pressure applied to a writing instrument, the angle and speed of the hand that formed each character. It could detect patterns invisible to the human eye, patterns buried in the ink itself. The project that brought this technology to bear on the scrolls was years in the making. Computer scientists, linguists, archaeologists, and biblical scholars worked together in ways that would have seemed strange, even impossible, just a generation before. High-resolution scans of the scrolls were fed into the system. The artificial intelligence was trained on vast libraries of ancient handwriting, and then it was set loose on the Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the most complete and most important texts ever recovered from the Qumran caves. The Great Isaiah Scroll is remarkable. It contains the entire book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, written on 17 sheets of parchment stitched together to form a scroll more than 7 meters long. It predates any previously known copy of Isaiah by roughly 1,000 years. Scholars had long assumed, based on their best analysis, that the entire scroll had been written by a single scribe, one dedicated hand working methodically from beginning to end. The machine disagreed. When the artificial intelligence analyzed the letter forms across all 66 chapters of the Isaiah scroll, it found something that human scholars had not seen. Halfway through the scroll, at the boundary between what biblical scholars call First Isaiah and Second Isaiah, the handwriting changed. Not dramatically, not in the way that would be obvious to a casual reader, but in the subtle geometry of individual letters, in the spacing patterns, in the microscopic habits of hand that every writer carries like a fingerprint. The system detected a clear and statistically significant shift. 2 different people had written this scroll, not one. This was not a minor finding. It had direct implications for one of the oldest debates in biblical scholarship, the question of whether the book of Isaiah was the work of a single prophet or multiple authors writing across different centuries. The artificial intelligence had not entered that theological debate directly, but by identifying 2 distinct hands in a scroll that scholars had assumed came from one, it added a new layer of evidence to a question humanity had been arguing about for centuries. And that was only the beginning. As researchers pushed further, expanding the artificial intelligence's analysis beyond the Isaiah scroll to other texts in the collection, the discoveries grew stranger and more unsettling. Fragments that had been assigned to the same document began showing signs of originating from different hands, different workshops, possibly different communities. The assumption that the scrolls represented the output of a single, unified scribal school began to crack. The dating also came under new scrutiny. Traditional methods of dating ancient manuscripts rely primarily on radiocarbon analysis and paleographic comparison, measuring the decay of carbon-14 in the parchment and comparing the style of handwriting to other dated examples. These methods are reliable but imprecise, and they carry margins of error that span decades, sometimes longer. The artificial intelligence, processing patterns across thousands of fragments simultaneously, began flagging inconsistencies. Certain texts appeared to carry markers suggesting they were older than previously thought. Others appeared newer. The timeline of when these documents were written began to blur and stretch in ways that challenged the established chronology. Then came the discovery that the researchers themselves seemed most reluctant to discuss openly. Hidden within certain scroll fragments, the artificial intelligence identified structural patterns that seemed to exceed what one would expect from ordinary scribal copying. Ancient manuscripts, when analyzed at scale, carry predictable statistical rhythms, the natural result of a scribe faithfully reproducing a text they are copying. But in specific sections of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the system detected arrangements that felt deliberate in a different way, repeating numerical structures, embedded sequences that surfaced across multiple documents, layered meanings within passages that read one way on the surface but contained a secondary architecture underneath. Were these codes? Were they liturgical devices, mnemonic tools, or something else entirely? The artificial intelligence could identify the patterns. It could not explain them. And that gap between what the machine could see and what it could not understand was perhaps the most unsettling space of all. Not everyone welcomed these findings. Within academic circles, the arrival of artificial intelligence in the world of biblical archaeology created a tension that was more than professional. For many scholars who had spent their careers mastering the art of reading ancient texts by hand, the idea that a machine could see what they had missed felt like more than an intellectual challenge. It felt like a threat to the very nature of their expertise. Some pushed back hard. They questioned the methodology. They challenged the training data. They argued that the artificial intelligence was detecting noise, not signal, finding patterns that existed in the data rather than in the original intention of the scribes. There were legitimate scientific arguments on both sides. Artificial intelligence is not infallible. Machine learning systems can find patterns that are statistically real, but historically meaningless. A system trained to look for differences will find differences, whether or not those differences carry the significance the researchers ascribe to them. The scholarly community's skepticism was not simply defensiveness, it was a necessary part of how knowledge is tested and refined. But the debate ran deeper than methodology. It ran into questions of faith. For billions of people around the world, the texts preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls are not merely historical documents. They are sacred. They carry the weight of divine revelation, of prophecy, of spiritual truth passed down across generations. When a machine begins to suggest that a scroll long believed to have a single author may have had two, or that a passage long understood one way may carry a secondary meaning the tradition never acknowledged, the implications extend far beyond academia. They enter the space where history meets belief, where data meets devotion, where the cold precision of an algorithm encounters the deepest convictions of the human heart. How does a community of faith respond when a machine tells them that the story of their scripture is more complicated than they were taught? How does a scholar respond when decades of careful human analysis are revised by a system that processed in weeks what took lifetimes to study? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions the Dead Sea Scrolls are now forcing the modern world to ask. And then there is the matter of the unidentified fragments. Among the 900 or so scrolls and scroll pieces recovered from the Qumran caves, a significant number have never been conclusively identified, fragments too small, too damaged, or too unusual to fit cleanly into any known text. They sit in archives and university collections, studied but not understood, labeled but not decoded. When the artificial intelligence turned its attention to these orphaned pieces, it began making connections that human scholars had not previously drawn. Certain fragments, long assumed to be from different documents, appeared to belong together based on microscopic analysis of the parchment, the ink composition, and the handwriting geometry. New documents, previously unknown, began to take shape. Some of these emerging texts appeared to contain ideas that did not align neatly with the religious community they were assumed to have come from, ideas that seemed to reach beyond the theology of any single Jewish sect of the period. Passages that echoed themes found in texts from entirely different parts of the ancient world, from traditions separated by geography and language, yet somehow sharing a common thread that the artificial intelligence kept pulling toward the surface. What were these texts? Where did they really come from? And why had they been buried in that desert for 2,000 years, as if someone had needed to hide them from a world not yet ready to receive them? The most unsettling possibility is one that researchers speak about carefully in the measured language of scientists who know how much weight their words can carry. It is this: the dead. Sea Scrolls may not represent the library of a single isolated sect. They may be something far more complex, a deliberate archive, a collection assembled with purpose by people who understood that what they were preserving was dangerous, contested, or revolutionary. People who buried their scrolls not simply to protect them from an advancing Roman army, but to preserve ideas that the dominant religious and political powers of their time were actively trying to erase. If that is true, then the scrolls are not merely ancient texts. They are a message packed into clay jars and hidden in desert caves, and addressed to no one in particular, waiting for whatever future generation would finally possess both the wisdom to find them and the technology to understand what they actually say. We may be that generation. 2,000 years of silence is a long time. Civilizations rose and fell above those caves while the scrolls sat undisturbed in the dark. Every religious tradition that shaped the modern world was built, at least in part, on foundations that the writers of those texts had laid. Christianity, Judaism, movements and ideas and institutions that have guided the spiritual lives of billions of human beings across 2 millennia, all of them downstream in some way from the world that produced the documents now being read by a machine for the first time. And what the machine is finding suggests that the story we have been telling ourselves about the origins of those traditions may need to be revised, not abandoned, not destroyed, but revised, complicated, made more honest, because the truth about where our ideas come from, about who wrote what and when and why and for whom, is always more complex than the tidy narratives we construct around it. There is something both humbling and terrifying about that realization. Humbling because it reminds us how much we still do not know about our own history. Terrifying because of what it implies about the foundations on which so much of human civilization stands. The boy who found those scrolls in 1947 could not have known what he was handing to the future. He was looking for a lost goat. He found something that would spend the next century refusing to be fully understood. And now, in a laboratory somewhere, a machine is reading what 2,000 years of human scholarship could not fully decode, sentence by sentence, letter by letter, pattern by pattern, working its way toward a truth that has been waiting in the dark for longer than most of the world's religions have existed. The questions the Dead Sea Scrolls raise have never been more urgent. They press against everything we thought we knew about the past. They ask us to consider whether the sacred stories we have inherited are the complete versions, or only the versions that survived. They ask us whether truth can be hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years, preserved in clay and parchment and ink, visible to every generation, that looked at it yet understood by none of them until a machine finally arrived to read between the lines. The scrolls are still being studied. The artificial intelligence is still working. The fragments are still yielding new connections. And somewhere in that archive, beneath the surface of texts that humanity has prayed over, argued about, and built entire civilizations upon, something is still waiting to be found. The only question left is whether we are ready to hear what it says.